Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to sleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching? Be comfortable and relax. The city streets lay eerily quiet on this cold winter evening. The usual hum of cars and chatter of pedestrians was absent, leaving only the faint sound of a distant breeze weaving between the towering buildings. Streetlights cast long, wavering shadows that stretched across the sidewalks. The protagonist, wrapped tightly in their coat, walked steadily through the silence. They savored the crisp night air, the rhythmic echo of their boots the only sound accompanying them. As they continued walking, the world around them seemed to stretch in odd ways. Familiar street corners appeared strangely distorted, their angles sharper, shadows darker. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. It wasn't just silence. It was an absence of life, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The protagonist's steps faltered for a moment, but they forced themselves to keep moving forward. The isolation should have been comforting. Yet, a deep, unsettling feeling began to crawl into their thoughts, unbidden. The cold air wrapped around them, biting at the edges of their scarf, but they hardly noticed. Their mind raced through rationalizations for their unease. It's just late, they thought. Everyone's inside by now, out of the cold. But logic couldn't shake the sense that something was subtly, yet undeniably, wrong. They focused on the sound of their own footsteps, letting it ground them. There was something oddly satisfying about the steady cadence of Saul's meeting pavement. It echoed against the emptiness, each beat a reassurance that they were, in fact, still there, still real. But even that comfort was fleeting. The echoes seemed off, slightly delayed, as though the walls of the buildings were holding the sound too long, stretching it. The protagonist's grip on their bag tightened as they glanced around. Their eyes flitted from one side of the street to the other, scanning for anything that might explain the strange atmosphere. There was nothing. No cars, no people, no movement. The windows of the surrounding buildings glowed faintly with yellow light, but they felt distant, untouchable, as though they belonged to another world. A shiver ran down their spine that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. "Stop it," they muttered under their breath, their voice sounding too loud in the oppressive stillness. They laughed nervously, trying to break the tension, but even their laughter felt wrong, swallowed up by the silent void around them. Their pace quickened involuntarily, as if their body knew something their mind refused to acknowledge. The tranquility of the evening had transformed into something else entirely. What should have been a peaceful walk now felt like navigating a dream, the kind where everything looks familiar, but you know you're being watched, chased, or trapped. They couldn't shake the sense that the quiet wasn't just quiet, it was listening. The rhythmic echo of their footsteps had become an anchor in the strange silence of the city. Step by step, it offered a comforting reassurance that they were alone, that they were in control. But as they turned a corner onto a narrower street, something new joined the symphony of their stride. Another sound? It was faint at first, a soft shuffle that almost blended with the distant hum of the wind. The protagonist's ears perked up, their steps slowing slightly as they listened. Probably just another pedestrian, they thought, dismissing the sound with a nervous chuckle. They glanced over their shoulder, expecting to see someone walking a fair distance behind them. The street, however, remained as deserted as before. They shook their head, trying to laugh off the tension. "I'm letting this weird night get to me," they muttered, resolving to ignore the sound. They quickened their pace, the rhythmic tap of their boots echoing louder against the buildings. Yet the shuffle persisted, faint but deliberate, matching their cadence beat for beat. The realization hit like a cold gust of wind. The footsteps were synchronized with theirs. When they stopped, the sound stopped. When they resumed walking, so did the faint shuffling. Their breath hitched as a chill spread through their chest, gripping them tighter with each passing second. They paused mid-stride and turned sharply, their eyes scanning the empty street. "Hello," they called out, their voice trembling slightly. Only silence answered. Their eyes darted between doorways and alleyways, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The street remained an empty tableau of flickering lights and deepening shadows. Despite the lack of evidence, the feeling of being followed had become undeniable. They turned back around and began walking again, their movements stiff and hurried. This time, they couldn't ignore the sound. It wasn't faint anymore. It was deliberate, measured, keeping perfect time with their steps. Each shuffle seemed to grow louder, more distinct, as though it were closing the distance between them. Their heart pounded against their ribs as they fought the urge to break into a run. Running would mean acknowledging the fear, giving it power. "Stay calm," they whispered, though their voice cracked under the strain. But calmness was impossible. The footsteps felt like a phantom presence, intangible yet inescapable. Every turn of the head, every glance over the shoulder revealed nothing, yet the sound persisted, a haunting echo that clung to them like a shadow. It was as though the city itself had come alive, watching, stalking, playing a cruel game of cat and mouse. With every step, the protagonist's dread deepened. The night, which had once seemed tranquil, had transformed into a stage for something sinister. And the footsteps, those mocking, synchronized steps, were the only indication that they weren't alone in this eerie, empty city. Their steps faltered as the sound behind them ceased entirely. For a fleeting moment, silence enveloped them again, and they dared to believe the ominous presence had gone. But before the thought could fully form, it happened. A whisper, soft yet chilling, pierced the stillness. It was so close that it tickled the hairs on their ear. "I know where you're going." They froze, every muscle in their body locking in place. The voice was neither loud nor aggressive, yet its proximity and intimacy sent a jolt of terror through their core. It felt as though someone had leaned in, their lips mere inches away. The words repeated in their mind, each syllable dripping with malice. The protagonist turned sharply, their eyes wild with fear. "Who's there?" they shouted, their voice echoing down the empty street. But no one answered. The street remained as it had been, deserted, cold, and shrouded in unnatural quiet. They spun around, searching the shadows, their breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. No matter where they looked, there was no sign of anyone. The realization settled over them like a suffocating weight. There was no one visible, yet the whisper had been unmistakably real. Their mind raced to rationalize the event. "Maybe I imagined it," they muttered, though they knew the lie sounded hollow even to their own ears. The voice had been too vivid, too deliberate. It wasn't a trick of the wind or a fragment of their imagination. Someone, or something, had spoken to them, and they were utterly alone with it. They took a step backward, then another, their gaze darting to every corner of the street. Every shadow now seemed to pulse with life, every flicker of a streetlight a harbinger of some unseen menace. The world around them felt alive with a presence they couldn't pinpoint, but it was there, watching, waiting. The whisper lingered in their mind, its chilling words repeating like a broken record. "I know where you're going." The certainty in that statement was what terrified them most. Whoever had spoken hadn't guessed or assumed. They knew. And in that moment, the protagonist felt completely exposed, as though every step they took, every thought they had, was being laid bare to an invisible observer. The street that had once been eerily silent now felt oppressive, each second stretching into eternity. They wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but fear had wrapped its icy fingers around their throat. All they could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the words echoed endlessly in their mind. "I know where you're going." Finally, summoning what little courage they had left, the protagonist turned on their heel and began walking. Their movements were hurried, desperate, as though putting distance between them and the source of the whisper might somehow bring them safety. But no matter how fast they walked, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't walking away from it. They were walking straight into it. The streetlights flickered as if mocking their fear, their glow pulsing in uneven waves. The protagonist quickened their steps, their eyes scanning every shadow, every alleyway, every doorway for any hint of movement. Yet, the world around them remained as it had been, empty, silent, and unyielding. But the silence no longer felt indifferent. It felt aware. It was a sensation they couldn't rationalize, a weight pressing down on them, prickling at the back of their neck. Every instinct screamed that they were being watched. It wasn't the paranoid notion of someone lurking in the distance. It was something more intimate, something that knew them, something that had already been close enough to whisper in their ear. The protagonist stopped abruptly, spinning around in a wide circle. Their breath came out in uneven gasps, visible in the icy air. They scanned the street for the 100th time, willing themselves to find the source of their unease. Nothing moved. The shadows clung to their places, stubborn and impenetrable. The empty windows of the buildings around them stared back like dead eyes. They rubbed their hands together, trying to fight the cold that now seemed to seep not from the air, but from within themselves. "There's no one here," they whispered. But the words felt meaningless, as if the act of speaking them out loud had made them less true. The sensation of being watched didn't abate. It grew stronger, more oppressive, as if an unseen force delighted in their denial. The protagonist resumed walking, this time with hurried, uneven steps. They didn't care about the rhythm of their boots anymore. All they cared about was getting away. From what? They didn't know, but the instinct to flee burned like fire in their veins. Their eyes darted toward every shadow, their ears straining for the faintest sound. But it wasn't sound that haunted them. It was the silence, the oppressive, knowing silence that felt like 1,000 invisible eyes locked onto them. The further they walked, the more the street seemed to change. It wasn't obvious, but the familiar landmarks looked subtly wrong, as if the world was rearranging itself behind their back. The buildings felt taller, the shadows deeper, the light weaker. It was as if the city was conspiring to trap them, to funnel them towards some inevitable, unseen destination. A bead of sweat rolled down their temple despite the freezing air. Their breaths came quicker now, shallow and ragged. They clutched their coat tightly around themselves, their hands trembling. The feeling of being watched had taken on a physical presence, wrapping around them like a suffocating fog. Every step forward felt like walking into the jaws of a predator, but stopping felt even worse, like surrender. Their mind raced through every possibility, every explanation. Could it be someone following them? A prank? A predator? But none of these thoughts held weight against the overwhelming certainty that whatever was watching them wasn't bound by the rules of the ordinary world. This wasn't a person. It wasn't even something tangible. It was a presence, vast and unrelenting, pressing in from all sides. They stopped again, their knees nearly buckling as they turned to face the way they'd come. The street stretched out behind them, empty and silent, the same as it had been all along. But the feeling didn't leave. It didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. Their stomach churned, and their legs felt weak, but they forced themselves to stand tall. "Who's there?" they demanded, their voice echoing uselessly. The sound bounced off the buildings and died in the distance, swallowed by the stillness. There was no response, but they hadn't expected one. Whoever, or whatever, was watching them didn't need to reveal itself. It didn't need to answer. It was in control, and it wanted them to know that. For the first time, they allowed themselves to consider the unthinkable. What if it wasn't a person? What if it wasn't anything they could see or touch? What if it was simply there, everywhere, nowhere? The thought chilled them more than the winter air ever could. It made their steps falter, their resolve waver. But they couldn't stop. They wouldn't. Whatever was watching them wanted them to crumble, to break, to surrender. And though every fiber of their being screamed that they were prey, they refused to act like it. They straightened their shoulders, clenched their fists, and pressed forward, their heart hammering in their chest. The feeling didn't fade. It didn't falter. But they kept walking, the oppressive gaze following them every step of the way. The feeling was unbearable now, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The oppressive presence at their back was no longer something they could try to rationalize. It was real. It was there, and it wanted them to know it. They broke into a hurried pace, their boots clapping against the pavement, the sound reverberating off the walls of the buildings around them. They glanced over their shoulder every few steps, their eyes darting wildly, desperate to catch sight of something, anything, that might explain the suffocating dread. But the street remained empty. It was maddeningly lifeless, save for the shadows that seemed to stretch toward them with every flicker of the dim street lights. The city felt different now, foreign and malevolent. Landmarks they should have recognized seemed alien, their edges distorted and wrong. It felt as though the world was folding in on itself, shrinking around them, leaving them no escape. Their breath came in sharp, shallow bursts as they forced their legs to move faster. Their mind raced, cycling through every worst-case scenario, every story of disappearances and unspeakable horrors that had ever crossed their ears. "Just get home," they whispered to themselves, their voice shaking. "You'll be safe at home." The thought of home became their only lifeline. The vision of a locked door, bright lights, and familiar surroundings pushed them forward, even as their legs screamed in protest and their heart pounded against their ribcage. They didn't care how loud their footsteps were now, didn't care how obvious their fear must seem to whatever was stalking them. All that mattered was getting away. Finally, the sight of their building came into view. Relief flooded through them, momentarily cutting through the fog of terror. They fumbled with their keys as they approached the front door, their fingers trembling so violently that they nearly dropped them. With a frantic shove, they pushed the door open and slammed it shut behind them, locking it with every bolt and chain they could find. They stood there for a moment, their back pressed against the door, their chest heaving as they tried to catch their breath. The silence inside the apartment was deafening, but it felt different from the silence outside. It was a protective barrier, a thin but crucial separation from whatever had been out there. Without hesitation, they moved through the apartment, flipping on every light, checking every corner, every shadow. The bright, artificial glow filled the space, chasing away the darkness but not the lingering fear. Their hands still shook as they set their bag down and collapsed onto the couch, their mind racing with the events of the night. But even within the safety of their home, the unease didn't leave them. The memory of the whisper, the synchronized footsteps, and the oppressive sense of being watched clung to them like a second skin. They glanced toward the window, half expecting to see a figure staring back at them. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through their body. They were safe, weren't they? The door was locked, the lights were on, and the world outside was firmly shut out. And yet, they couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that whatever had been out there hadn't given up. With trembling hands, they reached for their phone, thinking to call someone, anyone, to break the silence. But as they unlocked the screen, a single notification appeared, chilling them to the bone. "I know where you're going." The phone slipped from their hands and fell to the floor with a dull thud. Their hearts stopped, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. They stared at the screen, the words glowing menacingly, taunting them. And in that moment, they realized one terrifying truth. Home wasn't safe. It never had been. The protagonist sat on the floor, staring at the phone as if it were a cursed object. The words on the screen burned into their mind, looping endlessly. "I know where you're going." There was no sender, no explanation, just the chilling certainty that the message had been meant for them. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to stretch farther. Every creak of the floorboards thundered in the suffocating silence. They thought of the locked door, the bolted windows, the lights casting harsh illumination across every surface. None of it felt sufficient. None of it could protect them. Their heart thudded in their chest, the rhythm erratic and disjointed, as though it too had succumbed to the fear. They wanted to move, to run, to do anything other than sit frozen in place, but their body refused to obey. It was as if the oppressive presence that had stalked them through the streets had followed them here, seeping into the very walls of their home. "How do they know?" the thought whispered through their mind, icy and relentless. How did they know where I was going? No answer came. Of course, there wouldn't be. The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to torment. They replayed every step of the night in their mind, searching for clues, for some explanation, but the details blurred together. All they could remember. Every morning, without fail, the protagonist laced up their running shoes before the sun could crest the horizon. It had become a sacred ritual, a moment of solitude amidst a life filled with endless demands. The world before dawn was a different place, untouched by the chaos of the day. The air was crisp, carrying a faint hint of dew that lingered on the grass. Even in the heart of a bustling town, this quiet hour seemed to belong to them alone. The trail stretched ahead, winding gently through the park. It was a familiar route, one they had run so many times that they knew every bend, every stretch of uneven pavement, and every cluster of trees arching over like a cathedral ceiling. They appreciated the simplicity of it, the rhythmic slap of their feet against the gravel, the way their breath synchronized with the beat of their heart. Running wasn't just exercise, it was therapy. The protagonist cherished these mornings. The solitude allowed them to process their thoughts, to sort through the tangled threads of life. The silence of the trail wasn't oppressive but soothing, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant chirping of early birds. This hour was theirs alone, a pocket of peace stolen from a world that never stopped moving. On this particular morning, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The streetlights cast long, soft shadows as they jogged past. The sky wore the deep, inky hues of early dawn, with faint streaks of orange beginning to peek through. A layer of fog hung low to the ground, giving the park an ethereal quality. It was the kind of morning that made the world feel infinite, the kind that reminded them why they loved this ritual so much. As they turned onto the main stretch of the trail, their pace quickened slightly. The familiar ache in their calves and the burn in their lungs were welcome sensations, grounding them in the moment. They could almost predict every step, every twist of the path ahead. This predictable normalcy was what they cherished most. It was safe, dependable, unchanging. The world felt utterly still, as though it hadn't yet realized the day had begun. No other joggers were out this early, and even the usual distant hum of cars on the nearby highway seemed muted. It was just them, the trail, and the steady rhythm of their movement. The kind of peace that felt like it could stretch on forever. Yet, amidst the serenity, a faint flicker of something unsettled them. It was nothing concrete, just a whisper at the edge of their consciousness. They shook it off, attributing it to an overactive imagination, or perhaps the fog that made everything appear just a little off-kilter. After all, this was their sanctuary, a place they had run countless times without incident. What could possibly go wrong here? The protagonist continued, dismissing the thought as quickly as it had come. The trail was the same as it always was, every turn as familiar as the back of their hand. The sound of their feet against the gravel was steady and reassuring. This was their time, their space, and nothing could take that away. Or so they thought. The morning carried on as usual, or so it seemed. The peaceful atmosphere enveloped them like a warm blanket, lulling them into a false sense of security. They could never have predicted that this seemingly ordinary jog would be the start of something that would haunt them forever. The bend in the trail ahead led to a small clearing where the trees parted slightly, allowing the early morning light to filter through in streaks. Normally, this spot felt serene, a brief opening in the forest canopy that offered a glimpse of the world beyond the trail. But today, something was different. As the protagonist approached, their eyes caught a glimmer of something metallic reflecting the faint light. Parked awkwardly on the shoulder of a service road adjacent to the trail was an old sedan. Its weathered exterior, once a pristine white, had dulled to a patchy gray, streaked with grime. The headlights were dimly lit, casting weak beams that barely penetrated the fog clinging to the ground. The sight was jarring, out of place in the otherwise tranquil surroundings. The car's positioning was strange, its front wheels angled sharply as if it had been abandoned in haste. The driver's side door hung slightly ajar, exposing a sliver of the interior. From where they stood, the protagonist couldn't make out much, but the faint glow of the dashboard lights hinted at recent activity. They slowed their pace, their breaths steady but their heart beginning to quicken. There was no reason to be alarmed, they told themselves. It was probably nothing, a harmless situation, easily explained. Yet, the uneasy whisper that had crept into their thoughts earlier now returned, louder this time. Something about the car felt wrong. They glanced around, searching for any sign of movement. The trail remained deserted, the forest silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the breeze. No one emerged from the vehicle, no sound came from within. Still, the presence of the car disrupted the fragile sense of peace that the morning usually brought. Against their better judgment, they slowed to a walk as they neared the clearing. Their eyes flicked between the car and the surrounding woods, scanning for any indication of who might have left it there. But the more they looked, the more the scene seemed frozen in time, as though the car had materialized out of nowhere. The faint hum of the car's engine reached their ears, a low, almost imperceptible vibration that sent a shiver down their spine. The open door beckoned like an unspoken invitation, but the protagonist felt no urge to investigate further. Instead, they hesitated at the edge of the trail, their instincts screaming at them to move on. There was a strange stillness to the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The protagonist took a step back, the gravel crunching softly underfoot. They cast one last wary glance at the sedan, noting the way the dim headlights seemed to flicker ever so slightly, before quickening their pace to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the unsettling sight. For a moment, they considered the possibility of doubling back or taking a detour, but the thought of lingering near the car any longer was unbearable. As they rounded the next bend in the trail, the clearing faded from view, but the image of the mysterious sedan remained seared into their mind, its ominous presence refusing to be forgotten. As the protagonist continued down the trail, their mind kept circling back to the strange sedan. Something about it gnawed at them, an intangible sense of unease that they couldn't quite shake. The trail ahead curved sharply, its edges flanked by thick trees that cast elongated shadows in the dim light. And then, as they rounded the bend, they saw it, the sedan. It was parked further down the trail now, as if it had somehow moved ahead of them. The headlights were still dimly lit, the driver's side door slightly ajar. The faint hum of the engine was unmistakable, a low vibration that seemed to thrum in their chest. Their stomach churned as they slowed their pace, every instinct urging them to turn back. And then they saw him. A figure sat in the driver's seat, his form obscured by shadows. The man's head was tilted slightly, as though he were watching them approach. For a moment, the protagonist froze, their breath caught in their throat. The man raised a hand and rolled down the window just enough to speak. "Hey there," he called out, his voice calm but carrying an unnerving undertone. "Need a ride?" The words hung in the air, their simplicity belying the dread they inspired. The protagonist took an involuntary step back, their mind racing. The man's face remained hidden in shadow, but there was something in his posture, in the way he tilted his head, that sent a chill down their spine. "No thanks. I'm fine," they managed to reply, their voice trembling slightly. The man leaned forward slightly, his features still indistinct. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone almost playful. "It's not safe out here alone." The smile in his voice was unmistakable, and it felt wrong, too knowing, too sinister. The protagonist's heart pounded as they took another step back. "I'm fine," they repeated, their voice firmer this time. The man didn't respond immediately. He simply sat there, the silence stretching unbearably. Then, slowly, he leaned back into the shadows of the car. The window rolled up with an eerie finality, and the protagonist wasted no time. They turned and began walking briskly, their pulse racing as they resisted the urge to break into a run. But even as they put distance between themselves and the car, they could feel his gaze lingering, heavy and oppressive, like a weight they couldn't shake. The protagonist's steps quickened instinctively, the rhythmic crunch of gravel underfoot a desperate mantra of reassurance. They replayed the brief exchange in their head, the man's calm yet dissonant voice slicing through the silence of the trail. "It's not safe out here alone." The words reverberated in their mind, a sinister echo that refused to fade. They told themselves it was just a strange man, overly persistent and nothing more. But the gnawing sensation in their gut told a different story. They forced their legs to keep moving, resisting the urge to break into a sprint. Running, they reasoned, would only show fear. But the weight of the man's gaze pressed heavily against their back, an unspoken threat that made every step feel labored. As the trail bent again, they allowed themselves a brief glance over their shoulder. The car was no longer in sight, obscured by the dense trees, but the unease lingered like a shadow. The path ahead seemed to stretch longer than usual, the trees closing in as if conspiring to trap them. They didn't know when they had begun to run. Their feet pounded against the gravel with a ferocity born of pure adrenaline, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around them blurred, the trees melting into streaks of green and brown as they focused solely on escape. The air burned in their lungs as they ran, their heart hammering against their ribs. Every instinct screamed at them to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the sedan. But no matter how far they went, the oppressive feeling of being watched never left. Finally, the trail led to the edge of the forest, spilling out into the faint glow of dawn breaking over the horizon. The sight should have been a relief, but the protagonist couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they weren't alone. They dared a final glance over their shoulder, half expecting to see the car parked silently behind them. There was nothing. The empty trail stretched back into the woods, the shadows deepening as the sunlight began to filter through. But the absence of the car did nothing to soothe their nerves. They could still feel it, its presence, the man's gaze lingering just out of sight, as though it had burrowed into their very being. The trail that had once been a sanctuary now felt irreversibly tainted. The protagonist stood at its edge, staring back into the shadows of the forest as though the car might reappear at any moment. The morning light, once a welcome sight, now seemed too pale, too weak to banish the memories of what had happened. Every detail of the encounter replayed in their mind. The man's calm voice, his unsettling smile, the way the car seemed to follow without moving. The trail no longer felt like a place of peace. It had become a stage for something far darker, something they couldn't explain. They walked home slowly, their pace hesitant and their mind heavy. The rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath their feet had lost its comforting quality, replaced by a haunting echo that seemed to mock their fear. Even the streets of their neighborhood, lined with familiar houses, felt foreign now, as though the world had shifted in some imperceptible way. Back at home, they locked the door and double-checked every window. The safety of their walls felt fragile, paper-thin against the weight of what they had experienced. The man's voice lingered in their ears, a ghostly whisper that refused to be silenced. It's not safe out here alone. For the first time, they didn't feel safe anywhere. Not in their home, not on the trail, not even in their own mind. The world had become a darker place, and the memory of the man in the car was a shadow they couldn't outrun. Weeks passed, but the trail remained untouched. The thought of returning sent a shiver down their spine, the once beloved ritual now forever associated with unease. They couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, waiting, watching, and no matter how far they ran, they would never truly leave him behind. The intersection was silent, cloaked in the stillness of a late-night urban void. Not a single car rolled down the street, and even the faintest hum of distant traffic seemed to have vanished. The protagonist, Claire, sat in her old sedan, gripping the steering wheel tighter than she realized. Her hands were clammy, her knuckles white. The traffic light above her flickered erratically, casting an unsteady red glow on the desolate road. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard, 1:37 a.m. Too late for comfort, too early for the morning bustle. A perfect in-between where the world felt paused, eerie and wrong. She adjusted her seatbelt and stared through the windshield. The intersection streetlights buzzed faintly, a sound that clawed at her nerves. One light, in particular, seemed broken. It sputtered, struggled to stay lit, and then plunged the corner into shadows every few seconds. When it briefly came alive, it illuminated a man standing by the bus stop. Claire's chest tightened. He was tall, unnaturally still, his silhouette stark against the dim backdrop. The bus stop itself was ancient-looking, its peeling paint and graffiti-covered glass barely visible under the failing light. The man wore what looked like a long coat, but the details were hard to make out. His head was tilted slightly downward, as though he were studying the cracked pavement beneath his feet. Yet, Something about him radiated awareness. He wasn't just standing there. He was waiting. For what? For who? A shiver snaked down her spine. Claire quickly locked the car doors with a sharp click. The sound echoed in the confined space of her car, loud against the oppressive silence outside. She scolded herself for being paranoid. It was just a man waiting for a bus. This was a city. Strange things happened all the time. People wandered. People loitered. People waited. Right? But her instincts screamed otherwise. She glanced at the traffic light again. Still red. Her patience began to waver. This particular intersection was notorious for its poorly timed lights, often leaving drivers stranded for minutes on end. Claire exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the inside of the windshield for a moment. She tried not to look back at the bus stop, but her eyes betrayed her. The man hadn't moved. No fidgeting, no shifting of weight, no attempt to sit on the bench behind him. His stillness felt unnatural, oppressive even. It was as though he were carved from stone, a statue that somehow found its way to this ghostly corner of the city. Claire's phone buzzed on the passenger seat, breaking the spell. She jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. With trembling hands, she picked it up. It was a message from her friend. Rachel? Made it home safe? Text me when you do. Roads are creepy this late. Claire typed back hastily. Still on the way. Stuck at a light. Some weird guy is creeping me out. The moment she hit send, she felt silly for admitting her fear. But the unease clawed at her regardless. She set the phone down and dared another glance toward the man. This time, he was looking at her. Her stomach dropped. The streetlight illuminated his face for the briefest of moments before plunging it into shadow again. Claire's mind raced to piece together the details she'd seen. Sharp cheekbones, hollow eyes, and a mouth that seemed too wide, stretched unnaturally into something that wasn't quite a smile. But it was his eyes that struck her most. They were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel trapped, like prey under a predator's gaze. The flickering light above him buzzed louder, sputtering faster, as if reacting to his presence. Claire's breathing quickened. Her foot instinctively hovered over the gas pedal. She glanced at the traffic light again, willing it to turn green, but it stubbornly held its red glow. When she looked back at the bus stop, the man had taken a step closer. Her pulse thundered in her ears. No, she hadn't seen him move. He couldn't have. And yet, there he was, closer than before. The shadows around him seemed darker now, as though the night itself recoiled from his approach. Claire's mind screamed for her to act, to drive through the light regardless of the traffic laws. But her body remained frozen. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, trying to steady her trembling hands. Another glance at the man. Another step closer. He was now in the middle of the crosswalk, directly in her car's path. The flickering streetlight blinked out entirely, leaving him bathed in darkness. Claire gasped and turned on her high beams. The light cut through the shadows, illuminating the empty crosswalk. The man was gone. Her heart pounded against her ribcage. She frantically scanned her surroundings, the bus stop, the sidewalks, the other corners of the intersection. Nothing. Just empty streets and the suffocating silence of the night. The traffic light finally turned green, its glow piercing the tension like a beacon of salvation. Without hesitation, Claire slammed her foot on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, speeding through the intersection and leaving the Eerie corner behind. She kept checking her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man chasing after her. But the road behind her remained empty. As she drove, her phone buzzed again. With trembling fingers, she grabbed it, glancing at the screen. It was another message from Rachel. Whatever you do, don't stop for anyone. Just keep driving. Claire's blood turned to ice. She stared at the message, her mind racing with questions. How did Rachel know? Was it a coincidence? Her grip tightened on the wheel as her headlights illuminated the lonely road ahead. And then, in the distance, she saw him again, standing in the middle of the road, waiting. She slowed instinctively, her body betraying her logic. The man was illuminated in her high beams now, clearer than before. His features were sharper, almost exaggerated in the harsh light. That wide smile returned, stretched unnaturally across his face as though someone had pulled it taut from ear to ear. His eyes glistened with something Claire could only describe as hunger. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The wave was slow, almost casual, as if they were old friends exchanging a greeting. It was the kind of wave you'd give someone you knew well, but there was something horribly wrong about it. The motion was too smooth, too rehearsed, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. She couldn't look away. His smile widened further, stretching impossibly as he took a single step toward her car. Claire slammed on the horn, the blaring sound shattering the oppressive silence. The man didn't flinch. He took another step. Her instinct screamed at her to hit the gas, to leave him behind, but she was frozen, her hands glued to the wheel. The wave ended, his hand lowering to his side in one fluid motion. His smile remained fixed, a grotesque mask of false friendliness. When he reached the hood of her car, Claire finally snapped out of her trance. Her foot slammed down on the gas pedal, and the car roared forward. She expected to feel a thud, some impact, but there was nothing. The man was simply gone. Her heart raced as she sped down the road, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. For a moment, she saw nothing, and then, as if summoned by her fear, his face appeared in the reflection, that same unnatural smile staring back at her. She screamed, jerking the wheel slightly, but the image vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel harder, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. She forced her eyes back to the road ahead. The last thing she needed now was to crash. But the tension didn't let up. She could feel it, the oppressive weight of being watched. Against her better judgment, her gaze flicked to her rearview mirror again. He was there. This time, not just his face but his entire figure stood, illuminated in the red glow of her brake lights. He was standing in the middle of the road, motionless again. Claire instinctively slammed on her brakes. The car skidded slightly, tires screeching against the asphalt. Her heart thundered as she stared into the mirror, her mind screaming at her to drive, to escape. Before she could react further, the man moved. Not a casual stroll or a slow approach. This was deliberate. His unblinking eyes locked onto hers through the mirror as he began to walk toward her car. His movements were almost robotic, each step measured and precise. The fixed grin never wavered. Claire's body moved on autopilot. She locked the doors with trembling fingers, the click echoing in the silent car. Her pulse roared in her ears as she watched him close the distance. He was nearing the rear bumper now, his face illuminated eerily by the red taillights. Her breath hitched as he raised a hand again, this time placing it gently on the trunk of her car. The sound was faint but distinct, the tap of fingers against metal. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man leaned forward slightly, his head tilting as though to peer into the car. Claire couldn't see his eyes now, just the wide, grotesque grin stretched across his face. The air inside the car felt suffocating, the space closing in around her as her chest heaved with panic. Her foot slammed on the gas without thinking. The car surged forward, the sudden motion breaking the man's contact. She didn't look back this time, didn't dare glance in the mirror. All she could do was drive, her mind racing with terror as the road stretched endlessly ahead of her. When the light ahead turned green, Claire's heart leaped with hope. The man was now only a few feet from her car, his unblinking stare locked onto hers through the windshield. His smile remained unbroken, as though he was daring her to move. She didn't hesitate. The moment the light changed, Claire floored the gas pedal. The car's tires screeched against the pavement as it lunged forward, forcing the man to vanish from sight. In the rearview mirror, Claire caught one last glimpse of him. He hadn't moved an inch, standing in the same spot in the middle of the road. His head tilted slightly, the grin on his face impossibly wide. It lingered in her vision as she sped away, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Claire's hands trembled on the wheel, and tears blurred her vision. But she didn't slow down. The man's image burned in her mind, haunting her with every mile she put between them. Even as the road stretched endlessly ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching. For days after the encounter, Claire found herself unable to think of anything else. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that unnerving smile, wide and grotesque, staring at her from the darkness. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. The nightmares came too quickly, dragging her back to that cursed intersection. She told herself it was over, that she had driven far enough away from whatever had happened that night. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't truly escaped. The sensation of being watched lingered, clinging to her like a second skin. She avoided the intersection entirely, no matter the time of day. Even thinking about it sent her pulse racing. She chose longer, more inconvenient routes, just to ensure she wouldn't have to drive through that stretch of road again. Friends teased her for her paranoia, but Claire didn't care. She wasn't about to explain the true reason behind her fear, not when she wasn't sure anyone would believe her. Some nights, she swore she saw him, always at a distance, standing under a flickering streetlight or lingering at the edge of her vision. His presence was never clear enough to confirm, but always vivid enough to make her heart race. And the smile, she could feel it even when she couldn't see it. That terrible, impossible smile. Claire began keeping her curtains drawn at all times, especially at night. She couldn't bear the thought of looking out the window and seeing him standing there, waiting. Her life became smaller, confined by her growing fear. But no matter how much distance she tried to put between herself and that night, it never felt like enough. The grinning man was still out there, and somehow, Claire knew he would find her again. The woods had always been my sanctuary. Every corner of this sprawling forest felt alive with stories waiting to be discovered. For years, it had been my escape from the suffocating routines of daily life. The trees, towering like ancient sentinels, whispered secrets in the wind, and the air carried a sense of serenity unmatched by any other place. I found peace in its silence, solace in its solitude. I often stuck to the familiar trails, those well-trodden paths winding through the heart of the forest. They were comforting in their predictability, but on this particular day, something compelled me to deviate. As I strolled along the usual route, I caught sight of a narrow path almost hidden beneath the undergrowth. It was barely noticeable, as if nature itself had tried to conceal it from wandering eyes. Curiosity flared within me, a spark that grew impossible to ignore. I paused, letting my gaze linger on the overgrown trail. It seemed untouched, unspoiled by the steady stream of hikers that frequented the woods. The faint light filtering through the canopy gave it an ethereal glow, and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze seemed to beckon me forward. I hesitated briefly, glancing back at the well-worn trail I had come from. It was safe, familiar, but a deeper part of me craved the unknown, the thrill of uncovering something new. With a deep breath, I stepped off the beaten path and onto the untamed trail. The air felt different here, cooler and heavier, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The ground beneath my feet was soft with moss, and the trees grew closer together, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy above. The further I ventured, the quieter it became. The cheerful chatter of birds and the distant hum of insects faded, replaced by a profound stillness that pressed against my ears. The trail twisted and turned unpredictably, leading me deeper into the heart of the woods. The sunlight, once abundant, now struggled to pierce through the dense foliage, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. Despite the growing unease creeping into my chest, I pressed on, driven by a mix of curiosity and an unshakable feeling that this path held something extraordinary. Minutes turned to hours as I navigated the unfamiliar terrain. Time seemed to blur, each step pulling me further from the reality I knew. I began to notice strange markings on the trees, faint but deliberate. They were unlike anything I had seen before, symbols etched with precision, as though left by someone, or something, with a purpose. My pulse quickened, a nervous excitement surging through me. The deeper I went, the more the forest transformed. The vibrant greens of the foliage faded into muted shades, and an almost imperceptible mist began to creep along the ground. The air grew colder still, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang that prickled the back of my throat. It felt as though I had crossed an invisible threshold, stepping into a place where the rules of the natural world no longer applied. Despite the growing sense of unease, I couldn't turn back. The path seemed to pull me forward, its meandering course both disorienting and entrancing. It was as if the forest itself wanted me to keep going, luring me deeper into its shadowy embrace. And so, I did, with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation swirling within me. As the trail narrowed further, I noticed a faint sound in the distance. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. But as I continued, it grew louder, more distinct. It was a melody, haunting and beautiful, carried on the wind. My heart raced as I strained to locate its source, the eerie tune pulling me forward like a siren's call. Finally, the trail opened into a small clearing, hidden deep within the woods. It was an unexpected break from the dense forest, a pocket of open space surrounded by towering trees that seemed to lean inward as if to guard it. In the center of the clearing, my eyes were drawn to a peculiar sight, a freshly dug hole. It wasn't large, but it was unnervingly deep. The edges of the pit were jagged, and the dirt around it was scattered haphazardly, though the effort behind its creation was evident. Whoever had dug it had done so with purpose, yet the messy aftermath suggested either urgency or carelessness. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as I drew closer. The hole itself exuded an unnatural air. The soil, darker than the surrounding earth, seemed damp despite the lack of recent rain. A faint odor wafted from its depths, metallic and earthy, sending a wave of unease coursing through me. I peered into the void, straining to see its bottom, but it stretched further than the light could reach. A chill ran through me, and I instinctively stepped back, suddenly hyper-aware of the oppressive silence around me. The clearing felt wrong, as though it didn't belong to this world. The trees at its edge stood unnaturally still, their branches devoid of the gentle sway that had accompanied me earlier. The air was heavy, thick with an intangible tension that pressed against my chest. Something about the hole, its deliberate creation, its unsettling presence, seemed to pulse with an unspoken warning. Yet, despite the unease clawing at my senses, I couldn't bring myself to leave. The clearing, the hole, and the oppressive silence all felt like pieces of a puzzle, a mystery that demanded to be solved. My heart pounded as I stood there, torn between the primal urge to flee and the insatiable curiosity that had led me here in the first place. I was no longer sure if I had found this place by chance, or if it had been waiting for me all along. As I edged closer to the hole, my breaths came in shallow, quick bursts. The forest seemed to close in around me, its dense silence pressing against my ears. I bent slightly at the waist, peering once more into the gaping void when a sound pierced the air. A rustling, faint but distinct, erupted from the bushes behind me. I froze, my body rigid as ice shot through my veins. The sound came again, this time closer, the underbrush crackling as if something large was pushing through. My heart pounded violently in my chest, each beat reverberating in my skull. I turned my head slowly, straining to pinpoint the source of the noise. The rustling grew louder, more insistent, and with it came an unsettling sense of being watched. The clearing silence had shifted, replaced by an oppressive stillness that carried the weight of unseen eyes. My fingers twitched at my sides, the urge to bolt warring with the paralyzing grip of fear. I took a cautious step back, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots sounding deafening in the unnatural quiet. Whatever was out there, it was close. The bushes shuddered violently, and the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. The absence of noise was almost worse, my ears straining to detect even the faintest hint of movement. The forest held its breath, and so did I, suspended in a moment that stretched far too long. Then, as if the world itself had vanished, silence descended. It wasn't the serene stillness I had known before, but something oppressive, unnatural. My breaths were loud in my ears, a stark contrast to the absence of life around me. The trees loomed larger, their shadows stretching long and foreboding across the clearing. My vulnerability hit me like a physical blow. I was alone, utterly exposed. The clearing felt smaller, its boundaries closing in as if the woods themselves were alive and watching. My mind raced, desperate for an explanation, a reason for the unshakable dread pressing against me. Every instinct screamed that I shouldn't be here, that I had trespassed where I didn't belong. My pulse thundered, and I clenched my fists, willing myself to move, to make a decision, to fight or flee. But the weight of the silence pinned me in place, as though the very air had conspired to hold me captive. The oppressive tension thickened, tangible as a living thing, and I knew, deep in my soul, that whatever had caused the rustling wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking just beyond sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. Overwhelmed by the suffocating dread, I forced my legs to move. Slowly, I backed away from the hole, each step deliberate and measured, my body trembling with the effort to resist outright panic. The dense silence pressed against my ears, every crunch of leaves beneath my boots magnified to a deafening roar. My eyes darted between the trees, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but the forest offered no clarity, only layers of darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely. A primal instinct screamed at me to run, to put as much distance between myself and the clearing as possible. Yet I knew that panic could be deadly. The woods were disorienting enough, and one misstep could lead me further into its depths. Instead, I focused on retracing my steps, each footfall a silent plea to escape unscathed. The weight of unseen eyes bore into me, intensifying with every passing second. As I neared the edge of the clearing, a faint rustling emerged again, softer this time, almost teasing. My heart leapt into my throat, but I didn't dare look back. The oppressive silence followed me like a shadow, a constant reminder of the presence lingering just out of view. I broke through the tree line and onto the narrow trail, my breaths ragged and uneven. The forest felt no safer, but at least I was moving, putting distance between myself and whatever had lurked near the hole. The path ahead seemed endless, twisting and turning with no clear destination. My legs ached, and my pulse thundered in my ears, but I couldn't stop. The woods had turned against me, their sanctuary now a labyrinth of dread. And somewhere behind me, I could still feel it, watching, waiting. When I finally emerged onto the main trail, relief coursed through me like a tidal wave. The familiar worn dirt path stretched ahead, a lifeline leading back to safety. Yet, the weight of unseen eyes persisted, clinging to me like a second skin. Every shadow seemed alive, every distant sound amplified by my frayed nerves. I quickened my pace, desperate to leave the forest behind, but the sensation lingered. It followed me relentlessly, even as the dense woods began to thin and give way to the outskirts. Rationally, I told myself that I was alone, that whatever I had felt in the clearing was a trick of the mind, a response to the oppressive atmosphere and my own imagination. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling of being watched didn't fade with distance. It clung to me like an invisible tether, a constant reminder of the unseen presence that had lingered in that dark, forgotten place. Even as I left the forest behind, stepping into the open air and the reassuring familiarity of civilization, I couldn't shake the thought that something had followed me out,